Welcome back. With me now is Congresswoman Katherine Clark, Democrat from Massachusetts and Vice Chair of the Democratic Congress. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Katie.
The president is going to address the nation tomorrow in a primetime address. What do you want to hear from him?
Well, what I'd like to hear is some truthful information, and I'd like to have a discussion about what we can truly do to raise national security and make sure that Americans are safe and secure. What I'm afraid I'm going to hear is the more of the same, which is chaos and misinformation.
So if he comes on tomorrow and he declares a national emergency, what are Democrats going to do? Because he's already trying to lay the groundwork for it. He's already citing a Democratic Representative, Adam Smith, as saying that it is within his powers to declare an emergency. We want to get on the record to say that Adam Smith has clarified his comments, saying that the president's conflating these things. He wants to be clear that declaring an emergency on our border to take 20 to 30 billion out of the Department of Defense to build a wall is probably the worst public policy idea he's ever heard of. It would be horrific. That's what Adam Smith stands. What would the Democrats do if he did try to declare a national emergency tomorrow?
Well, you know, the whole idea that if there's truly a national emergency, that your response would be to build a wall that I would assume would necessitate years, possibly the fastest you could do it is in months. And that's like saying a hurricane is coming and I am going to move my house in response. This whole idea of declaring a national emergency is ludicrous because there isn't one. And if there truly was an emergency like the president wants to portray, and we think that he will try and sell the American people on this falsehood tomorrow, then what has he been doing for the last 2 years when he had Republican control of the House and the Senate and the White House? It is dangerous to see our Secretary of Homeland Security out there endorsing this, trying to stoke fear and anxiety about an emergency that simply doesn't exist.
Are there any plans being made or any meetings being had by Democratic leaders about what you guys as a whole will do to push back against the president if he does decide to declare a national emergency? Any lawsuits that are being considered? Anything at all?
You know, what we are talking about in the House is, you know, if he does that, we will look at what we can do as a Congress. We will take legal action if that's what's necessary. But at the same time, this week, we are going to move forward with our goal, which is twofold. One is to end this shutdown immediately, to get our federal employees back to work, to make sure that the small businesses across the country that depend on their contracts that will never see that money start having the money that's due to them come back. Just today, I heard a story of a woman undergoing cancer treatment, and she was trying to refinance her house in order to have some income coming into her family, was unable to do it because she can't get the documents necessary from the federal government. These are the sort of real impacts that we're seeing in my communities and around the country. And so our goal is to end this shutdown and get back to work on not only having a real discussion and negotiation over border security, but getting back to addressing health care, looking at infrastructure, making sure that we are doing what we're going to put a bill forward on Tuesday, addressing gun violence in this country. Those are the issues the American people clearly told us in the midterm they want us working on. And this wall is a political football for the president that he is now dragging the American people, federal workers, and our economy into.
Congresswoman, what is your definition of border security?
Border security is defined for me by making sure that we have an immigration process that makes sense, that we are using the highest technology to make sure that our borders are secure and that people who seek to do us harm remain outside, that we are looking at how drugs actually come into this country, which is usually through our ports, that we have ways to detect that we are using tunneling detection, which we know is a problem at our borders, that we are providing cell service to our Border Patrol agents who, very concerningly, are not being paid during this shutdown. Just flying to Washington last week, I had a TSA agent plead with me to do everything we can so that he gets paid for the hours that he's putting in. I don't think Donald Trump has ever had to live paycheck to paycheck, and I don't think he understands that for most American families, the reality is those bills don't wait, and there isn't a huge pile of savings that lasts very long, and that this is a true burden on those people for a project that is just a pet policy that came out of a campaign rally.
Can you say definitively that there are no sections of the border that wouldn't benefit from having a piece of a wall or any more wall, fence?
I think there are parts of the border that would benefit from repairing fencing and other barricades that already exist there. But that's not what the president's talking about. The president is talking about a wall that would cover 2,000 miles. And he's now talking about taking private land for this wall. He never talks about the fact that it simply can't be built the way he envisions it. And to watch our Secretary of Homeland Security, to watch the Chief of Staff and others in this administration buy into this fantasy takes us from the realm of the ludicrous into the realm of the dangerous.
One last question for you. Do you think it's too early to talk about impeachment?
I do. And let me tell you why. I think that what we have to focus on are the issues that I talked about earlier, those issues that matter to American families at home. Impeachment will come as the facts show that it is necessary.
Are you talking about the Mueller investigation specifically, or is there anything else?
Well, I think we definitely need to have the Mueller investigation, but there may be other facts that come out.
Like what?
But right now, our focus needs to remain on coming up with those common sense solutions that matter to American families. That's why they sent us to Congress. That's what they're looking for us to do.
What other things could be out there other than the Mueller investigation that you think would be impeachable offenses? Potentially.
I mean, I'm not going to speculate. We have to let the facts dictate our actions in Congress.
I'm just trying to figure out what sort of facts you're looking for. If it's just the Mueller investigation, the results of the Mueller investigation, that's one thing. Or if there's behavioral issues, et cetera.
The Mueller investigation is definitely the primary source that we are looking for and waiting for. But this is a chaotic president with lots of different parts of his presidency and his past conduct and behavior under investigation. I mean, we have a very unusual and dangerous situation where we have a president of the United States who has been told he can't sit on a nonprofit board in New York State. So where some other offenses or conduct may come from is really hard to predict with a president who is this chaotic.
Congresswoman Katherine Clark, Congresswoman, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.